This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 101 of the Inktofilm podcast, where we read the book
and then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week we discuss Alvin Schwartz's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark books and André Øvredal's 2019 film of the same name. So, be honest with me. You're a fully grown adult at this point.
I am.
How scary do you find these stories? Does it still terrify you?
Yeah. I don't know. Fear's a funny thing, especially when it comes to adults reading scary stuff, right? Because on one hand, people often will say like, oh, this thing scared me. But then there's often also this other contingent of people who refuse to ever admit anything scares them, right? It's this like macho thing of like, that's not scary. That's not scary. That's not scary. You'll see that in the comments. This movie wasn't scary. This book isn't scary. I don't know the fuck you're talking about. And part of that is the Stephen King phenomenon, I think, where he says like, the fear bone is different, like the funny bone. It's different in everybody, I guess, right? And it affects people differently, and different things scare people different ways. We talked about that in Pet Sematary, I think. And I think that's probably true here still. Definitely. So I think there's like 100 stories, or approximately, over 3 books here that we both read all of them. And there's a wide variety of what kind of stories they are. You have humorous stories, you have jump scare stories, and then you have approximately a third of them that are actually intended to be some sort of like creepy story, whether it's a ghost story or about a monster or about a person doing a monstrous thing. And that's obviously the subsection that's most likely to be frightening. And it's not like in the moment I was terrified, but I will admit that I had a nightmare the day before I went and saw the film, so it was from reading the books. And in that nightmare, there was Harold and the big-faced, like, black-haired, beady-eyed woman. I forget what story, the name of the story that one's from the 3rd book. They both appeared in it. Now, maybe that's more Stephen Gammell's illustrations that are giving me nightmares. I don't know. There certainly wasn't really a lot to do with the stories themselves. It was more the images. But yeah, so, 33-year-old man having a nightmare about those books. So I think that's a testament to it.
Yeah. Where to even begin with this? So it's like you were saying, there's there's atmospheric, scary, kind of like haunting things that really like burden you and like you carry with you and you think about later, versus jump scares versus every type of like gruesome gore or something like that. And so like you said, it's different for everyone. Horror, but this has like this really and like come to find out in this documentary that we watched as well, we'll talk about more. But come to find out, a lot of this is built in like research from folklore from other countries and here and there, and there is sort of this like nursery rhyme quality to it, while also being like really disturbing in some ways, and then other times like really funny or surprising. And I think that this sticks with me in a way that is atmospheric. It's not necessarily about like, oh my god, that was such a scary story, but it's just like the details that you think about, like that's such a great terrifying detail, and you think about it from the perspective of a child, which is the other thing. It really can stick with you, and I think that like you said, is a testament to these kind of scary stories for children that adults can appreciate as well.
So that leads me to my next question. What is your experience with these books? Did you read them when you were a kid? Are you coming to this stuff new?
So I remember seeing the covers, and I was sure that I had read some of them. And as I was going through them, nothing was ringing bells. And then every once in a while there'd be a story, and I'd be like, I know this story. This has something that I've read before. So like, for example, like the Hearse song. Mm-hmm. Here I wrote a few down. Hang on one second. High Beams is just like the one where there's
and that's kind of an urban legend type story too. Like that and Hook both feel like urban legend stories you might have heard anyway, regardless of this book.
Yeah, but the one that I know for sure is Mitai Dodi Walker.
Really?
That was like, yeah, I knew like that, like when I was reading that, I was like, this is like the rhyming and everything about it. I was like, I've totally read this before in some way. So I didn't think going in, I didn't think that, like I was like, yeah, I'm familiar with a lot of the imagery and I've seen the books before and I thought that I'd read some of them. But as I started to read them, I was like, maybe I didn't. And then a couple stories really stood out to me. So I'm pretty sure that I've read some of them, but not like this, the way that we went through it.
Right.
I wasn't like really steeped in it or anything.
Okay, so I'm a bit of the opposite with that. I was an original huge super fan of these books. So I was born in 85, and the first book came out in 81, the second book in 84, and then the third and final book came out in 91. For whatever reason, I never owned the third book. I bought it this time when we were reading because I had my 2 old copies, like from a childhood, of the first 2 still to go through. And but the third one I didn't have, so I guess I just missed that one. Some of the stories in there were familiar, so maybe a friend of mine had them or something. I'm not really sure. But regardless, I grew up on these books, and I consider them pretty foundational for me. And I was really trying to figure out why that is. And I think reading it this time, I had a strong appreciation for what Alvin Schwartz was able to do with these stories. So, like you mentioned before, like he researched a lot of this stuff and found a lot of it, whether it was in the libraries or talking to people around the country or what have you. And then he boiled it down. I kept thinking of like boiling it down to just the bones, like a skeleton, in some twisted way, like these stories often reference, to where it was as simple gets for the most part, right? Like the stories are like a man met a woman. That woman seemed like she was alive. He gave her a thing. Later, he finds out she's dead, yet she still has the thing when he sees her later. And that's the story that's in this book in like 10 different forms. You know what I mean? Like, or some variation of like a subtle twist or like a slight twist where it's like, and that person was dead, or you were dead, or, the death is coming for you or something. It's all very death related, obviously. And I think for a kid reading about death, and this is talked about in the documentary and stuff, I think that is an important moment. It's like when you're faced with mortality and you're faced with the idea that you can die, and like just the way that our society has handled that over time, and like whether that's folklore about it or sort of the hearse song, which has sort of a moral to it of like, don't laugh at the hearse because you could be the next to die, right? So I think it strikes to children in that way. You have this really dramatic imagery that really sticks with you. But then I am trying to get to a point here. I'm just rambling a little bit. But the point I'm trying to get to is, for me, this book is also an instructional book. And it was literally this is how you tell scary stories book. And here are some you can tell. And so when I would read these short stories, like almost microfiction, it was so accessible and so simple that even like 8-year-old me would read it and go, I can do that. I can tell a story like this. And sure enough, I started doing that. And I know some of my siblings, definitely some of my cousins and friends, I would tell them stories. And I would just make them up. I would improvise them on the spot. I wouldn't sit down knowing what I was going to really talk about. I would just say, I'm going to improvise a scary story. And I would improvise some shit. I would throw in a twist ending where someone ended up being dead or something. And that was the story, right? Or there was a ghost. And those early storytelling moments for me, I think, really started me down the path of like wanting to tell stories and write and talk about stories like on a podcast, So pretty foundational in that sense.
It sounds a lot like your D&D skills as well, right? Like it's sort of that like improvisational and like on the fly, creating some sort of interesting twist or element. And that's really cool, man.
Yeah, and this probably predates me playing D&D too, because I remember playing D&D for the first time around the time I was 12. And I definitely remember telling these stories earlier than that. There was probably some overlap, but I think I really started when I was like probably like 8 or 9 or 10, somewhere in that range.
So you mentioned how death plays a huge part in these books, and they are specifically geared towards children.
Yeah.
And we've kind of talked about this kind of stuff before with children in peril and like not treating children like they can't know anything and like sheltering them. I think we've kind of touched on those kinds of subjects before.
Yeah.
And it's just like our own personal viewpoint on this kind of stuff. But I felt like, especially watching the documentary, I felt like there was something, and I don't know if it's necessarily laugh at death or if it's kind of being familiar with death, or because it feels like a lot of these stories, like you said, like some of them are morality tales. It feels like a lot of them are throughout. Like every single one seems like it has some sort of lesson to it, or some sort of cautionary tale or something like that. And I think that's why it makes for a good kids book. Although, and the imagery is really shocking and really haunting and grotesque in ways, and just like really scary stuff. I think that the combination of the writing and the illustration and is what's like really cemented this book for a lot of people. Because in the documentary we watched, I think it's just called Scary Stories, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
You can see the influence it has on people who were, and like while we were reading this and while we were watching the doc, I was like, I can totally see why like this was foundational for Luke. Like I was thinking about that. I was like, this totally seems like his sort of like, I could see how the kid who would one day like get super into metal, like all that kind of stuff, like could see all this stuff as like foundational.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I mean, that documentary I think did a good job of showing that there are a lot of people around my age who think of these books fondly, and there's a lot of people who had sleeve tattoos or full back tattoos of this art, and were sharing it with their children, and then I also liked how they showed the other side, and that was sort of the moral panic and this satanic outrage of the 80s, right, where everyone was like, oh my god, D&D is gonna poison the minds of our children, and these books, which the documentary does a good job of showing that they were widely banned and they were sort of considered like contraband. And I remember that being kind of a thing too. Like it felt like a book you almost shouldn't have. And I think a lot of that comes back to the folklore element, right? Because it's like, it lends it a weight. And so even if each individual story isn't that terrifying sometimes, the idea that you're holding something of like folklore that's been passed down to the generations, like gives it a truth.
It feels like this ancient story, like an ancient magic or an old something that's always been there kind of thing. But I wanted to ask you, did you experience any of that in school with the ban? Like, were you trying to like sneak the books into school, and like, did you have any banning going on? Because it reminded me of something that I had growing up.
Okay. Well, I'm pretty certain they did not have it in the school library. So it was probably on a list and not there. I had the books at home. I probably did bring them in my bags and stuff sometimes. I don't have any like clear memories of like a teacher seeing them and getting upset or anything. No. Okay.
Because I remember when I was growing up, the Harry Potter books. And the reason I want to bring this up is because especially in the documentary as well, people make the argument that like, oh, it's grotesque and it's gruesome, but then there will be people of a religious background that are saying like it's not good, it's immoral to have it there, and the people who are for the books would say, is it because of it's against your religion, because you feel that it's like immoral based on your religion, or is it immoral just based on it being grotesque for everyone? Kind of just like seeing whether it was like if the book should be in libraries and if it was like freedom of expression or freedom of speech, I guess. The thing that it made me think of is when I was growing up, Harry Potter was by religious groups, people, and I don't want to specifically say religious groups, but I remember in my experience there were people who were religious.
It was a lot of that, yeah.
That wouldn't let their kids read Harry Potter based on like witchcraft and like three-headed dogs and things like that people saw as like satanic or whatever. Like it went from, there were things like Scary Stories and D&D and Harry Potter. I feel like there's always somebody who latches onto that stuff and doesn't necessarily read it, but sees it as a potential, scarring device for their children. You know what I mean? Like it just seems like they worry about it without the context.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. I think this is one of those cases where some people are worried about the effect it's going to have on society, and like I don't have a good answer for that. That's something that they had, like the person who spearheaded the effort against these books was in the documentary, and she's 25 years later she still believes that they shouldn't be available for children who are in elementary school, which to me is kind of a funny thing because I'm sitting here thinking about how these are some of my favorite books from childhood. Like I literally don't remember hardly any of the other things I was reading at the time. Yet I can look back on these books with clear memories. And I think there was also a social element of it for me, the storytelling element like we've talked about. I remember this is the kind of book you would get under the covers with, light up some flashlights, with all the lights out in the room, and try and creep your friends out on it, if they were staying over for the night. It was fun. And it was fun, I think, at that age to engage with something that maybe was a little bit pushing the boundaries of what, most of the time you're getting in your entertainment. And I grew up in a household where my father would often talk about the end of the world. And that was something that I was aware of from a young age. Like, the world's going to end any day now was something I would think about a lot because I'd hear that from him a lot. And if Dad, if you're listening, hi, love you. But it would worry me, and I'd stay up at night having nightmares and about the world ending. And I think these books were kind of nice because it was like I needed something that would like justify the idea that I would be afraid of death and talk about it in a way frankly. And I don't know, and it's also that time of your life where you still believe in ghosts, and maybe you still do as an adult, but like I don't anymore, but I did then. And so I wanted to believe in all this stuff. So in that sense, it was scarier too, because it felt so real and immediate.
Two things I want to say. Just going back to the banning of the book thing, it's interesting how when these things start to get banned and talked about on the news, that's when people really start to seek it out also. It kind of has the adverse effect. People are like, we want to bury these books, and then they turn into even bigger phenomenons than they were.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a boost of popularity whenever you do that.
Yeah. And then you were talking about the way that engaging with this was slightly beyond your years maybe, or just the way that it was allowing you to think about death at a young age. I think that it's also interesting to think about the way that Schwartz stacked these stories in a row, because you would have these really ominous ones that would make you question your mortality and like the decision making that you do and like what's going to happen to you when you die. And then he'd have the next story would be like somebody died, and like it'd be lighthearted, and it didn't seem like it was this thing that was to be feared always.
Yeah.
So I thought that was like a fun way to keep it serious and light at the same time.
Yeah, there is a lot of that. Like you look, it's like you're getting all these different views. That's because folklore is like that, right? Like there's different ways that people deal with this stuff. So yeah, some stories are intended to frighten you. Some stories are intended to give you like a thrill and then a laugh. And that's the ones where it says like, grab a friend and yell, ah, right? And it's literally telling you in the book to like startle your friend. And then of course, what follows that is everybody laughs, theoretically. Then there's like the goofy ones where it's just about like a guy with an accent, right, wanting to wipe your windows, and so like I remember thinking that was funny as a kid, and like Bloody Fingers, like the guy who like yells at the ghosts like cool it man, get a Band-Aid or whatever, right? I think is the punchline of that one, and I loved that story growing. I remember telling that all the time to people, and because it was stupid, I don't know, and it went somewhere you weren't expecting the story to go because it seems like it's a story about this is going to be really scary. So it was having fun with it. And I think there was some power to that I really appreciate. So we did see this movie, which I definitely want to get to eventually. And we're going to save spoiler talks for later. But do you have, what more do we want to say about the books before we get to movie talk?
I did really enjoy myself reading these stories. It was a lot of stories to read, but they would just blow by. They were so much fun to read, and each one would be investing in I would get invested in a different way.
That does remind me. So I think you mentioned something about listening to audio for this book. What?
Yes.
So did you listen to all of them on audio, and how was that?
So no, I listened to one of the 3 books on audio.
Okay.
And it was interesting because although you don't have the visual element immediately in front of you, the narrator, his name is George S. Irving for this audiobook, was really, really good. Like extremely, extremely engaging. And
okay.
he would get into like the different like ghost noises and like the thumps, and the way that he would sing and rhyme, which is something else we should talk about, is the way that like, although we've talked about it being folklore, a lot of the alliteration in these stories and like repetition, it makes for it just like it gets stuck in your head kind of.
Yeah.
They become like me tie Dodie Walker. I just kept saying it. I was just like in my head. It's just like and I don't know why. I don't know that I fully understand a lot of these things too. Like,
sure.
I get that it's from some folklore probably, but like, why is me tie Dodie Walker getting stuck in my head?
I don't know.
It's just,
it always feels like there's more to the story too, which is kind of a cool thing about this, where it's like this is a piece of a story that's been almost sanitized for this book, and if you were to go hear the real story, it might be way darker.
Some of the time the shorter stories were the ones that stuck with me more, just because it's so short and you have such a small snapshot of the story going on. And your imagination runs more wild. The ones that are like, 10 pages or whatever, those ones you like to get invested in, you see where it's going all along. But the ones that are like just one page, sometimes you just sit there and think, and you look at the image a little more and you're like, damn, this one's like, I don't know. For some reason, sometimes the shorter ones just seem to leave me thinking a little bit longer.
One of my absolute favorites from all three books is it's called The Bed by the Window. And do you remember this story? It's about the three old men in the nursing home.
That was another one that I felt like when I read that one, I was like, I've totally heard the story before. I've totally read this before.
I love that story, and I think it's genuinely a great story. And I think as a kid, like the idea, it was layered in a way. And essentially, to retell it briefly, it's about three men in a nursing home, and I guess they're all so decrepit they can't get up and like do anything. They're basically bedridden, and the one furthest to the side has a bed in front of a window, and when he dies, then the two move over one bed, and the guy who newly has the window spot starts telling the other guy all of the stuff that he's seeing through the window. He's like, tells the story of all this cool stuff. He sees a pizzeria, and he can see the sun shining and all this stuff, right? And it starts to make the other guy super, super jealous. And eventually this other guy finds a way to like knock the heart medicine off so that the guy can't have his heart medicine when he has a heart attack. And he kills him so that he can get the bed by the window. Then he gets the bed by the window, and he looks out and he just sees a blank brick wall. So that's the turn of the story. And I love it on multiple levels, right? It's the idea that the other guy was lying just to like build it up and like talk about how great it is, even though he would have been exposed to the same disappointment. You know what I mean? So that was how he chose to react. And then of course the idea that like jealousy could lead you to murder. And then there's definitely like a morality tale there. And then the psychology behind it too, like being trapped and just desperately wanting to see something in anything. The idea of being like trapped on your bed and old and you have no one left, like that's dark in and of itself. There's a lot going on, and this is like a 250 word story probably. Like it's so short and just delivers.
There's also something there about the man the second person to get to the window. Yeah, he is kind of. Because you don't know who's going to die first, Like right. He could have been, he's kind of doing him a mercy, telling him all of these things and giving him something to look forward to, or like a goal or something.
He was almost trying to help him out, yeah.
He was helping him. It was like he was being a good person. And then just that idea that once he's killed him, he's thinking like, oh wow, he was looking out for me. And yeah. I killed him, yeah.
It's dark, man. And that's when this book's at its best, when it has a story like that, I think. And there are a few like that. Do you have any other standout stories that other than the Mitai Doti Walker story, which has a talking dog in it, which is also kind of weird, which they kind of allude to in the movie. We'll get to later when we talk about. Yeah. The
Mitai Doti Walker is one of the ones that I heard on audiobook. Mm-hmm. And the guy absolutely crushes it. He gets louder, and it's scary. It was scary to listen to. I was listening to it at night. Yeah. And I was like, this is like, I listened to it. Actually, I listened to the whole thing and then took it back to listen to it again.
That reminds me of a lot of these stories are like that. Like something is said and then it gets louder and then it gets louder, then it gets louder. And then there's usually a jump scare or something, or a joke, right? Usually it leads to something. There's a story about a ghost. I think it's in volume 3. There's like a ghost in the room, and I think it's in this funny story section, right? And it's about this girl who sees this like spirit in her room, and she tells her parents and stuff, and they come, they can't see it, and then every night it like gets closer, and it's like on the dresser, and then it's like on the roof, and then it's on the edge of the bed with her, and it's got a terrifying piece of art next to it. And the story itself literally is one of the scariest like build-ups. And then at the end, she like blows a raspberry, like the ghost blows a raspberry at her. But it didn't really matter because the build-up of the story is so terrifying. And with that art, like you would be so fucking scared if you saw that. I don't know. It just that reminds me as a scary piece, even though it was one of the funny ones.
That I think that was in the last book. Like that was one of the last stories in the last book, and I remember thinking that it was pretty funny. So one that really stands out to me, I can't really remember exactly what the name is. I think it's Sounds, but it's like these guys are in this lighthouse, and they keep hearing stuff. Do you remember this one?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just looked it up to make sure. It is called Sounds. So they're all staying at this lighthouse, and they hear like a woman screaming, crying out in pain. They're all like huddling together, and they're starting to get really scared, and they're like, "What's going on?" Like the rain is like pounding on the lighthouse. Like basically, they're trapped in this place.
Don't they like run out into the night at one point, afraid or something?
I think so, yeah. Like it gets to a point where they keep hearing stuff, and it just becomes so terrifying that they have to run off into the night.
And then I think a visage appears or something, right?
Yes.
Is the kind of the end of that?
That was like one of the ones I wrote down as like one of my favorites. Like as soon as I finished it, I just wrote down the lighthouse one.
Yeah.
That one, in addition to the wreck, which was the one where you kind of referenced earlier.
Yeah.
Like he like gives her something, and
that's like one of the best versions of that story, but I think it kind of appears several times throughout the books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That one.
I think it's like tinsel in her hair or something, and then it's like still there at the end. Yeah.
He had given it to her, and like he like avoid a wreck.
She mentioned she wrecked her car and then like walked or something, and then like they went to the dance, and then he was taking her home, and he ended up dropping her off, and then he saw like a fire, and he went and saw this like car on fire, and like her body was in there. And yet it had the tinsel in the hair, but it was clearly from like earlier. I don't know. So it's this like time bendy ghost thing.
So the ones that I wrote down, I have also Her Song was just, I mean, it's got to be the most famous from this whole collection.
Yeah, for sure. Good one. It's good.
It's so good. And then maybe second most famous would be Harold, which is another one I wrote down.
Yeah.
And they cover that in the movie.
Yep.
Did you have an attachment to this story before? Like back when you were a kid, do you remember reading Harold? Did it stand out to you?
So Harold's in book 3, which is the one that I had the least familiarity with. Most of the ones that I like really fondly remember were in the first 2 books. So yeah, that one wasn't as strongly for me, but it was a good story when I read it. But it wasn't one that I was like, I remembered it clearly when I sat down to read it.
The other ones I have written here are, I had High Beams that I mentioned earlier. The Viper I wrote just because it's funny, and I think it's really well set up, because I was reading it not remembering it at all if I have ever read it, and I was like, ooh, the Viper, like he's on his way. What's going on here? Because you know what's funny is it takes place after, I think, The Babysitter, which The Babysitter is the one where like somebody's calling from inside the house, which is like a classic horror thing. So somebody's calling from inside the house, and then eventually you get to the Viper, and it's somebody saying like, I'm coming for you, and you're like, is this kind of the same thing going on? And then he's like, I'm the Viper, I'm coming to you, and then
wipe the windows.
Wipe the windows.
Yeah, I mean, and that does remind me that there are a few of these that like seem a little problematic these days. I know there's a couple in there where the lesson of the story seems to be like, if you're a fat person, then you're comical. I know there's one where like a fat person dies and comes back as a hog, and that's like the joke of the story. And so there's definitely some stuff in here that hasn't aged very well. But like honestly, if you're going to be looking through old folklore, like there's going to be a lot of that, right?
Yeah. So there's also the body horror, right? Like people turning into creatures and like losing stuff like that, like things bursting open, body parts falling off or whatever.
Oh yeah, the cannibalism. There's like tons of cannibalism in these stories. There's one, I think it's called like the sausage or something about sausage, and there's like that one's. The picture is literally like an arm eating itself with a fork, and it's basically about like a butcher who would like grind up people and sell them as sausage that tasted amazing. And I remember reading that as a kid and it just being like so disgusting and terrifying, for sure.
And then eventually like he's killing kids too is the scary thing.
Oh yeah,
he's, like,
and like puppies and kittens, which there's a lot of like dogs and cats that die in these stories too, for sure. Yeah.
That's the other one too, the black dog, right? Yeah. Like the guy kills the dog, he kills the guy and then the dog haunts him forever. That one kind of stood out to me as well.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's a lot of good stuff, a lot of frightening stuff.
I wanted to ask you your favorites though, real quick.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of been talking about a lot of them. One of the ones I'm going to mention is the one that honestly, like, to me, like, because I do listen to some true crime and podcasts, and so I know a lot of this stuff, and like this one definitely seems like a warning about like Ted Bundy and people like this. But there's a story about a woman who's in college, and she comes back to her dorm room, and like her friend, she's like talking to her friend and not getting any response or something, and then she like wakes up the next day and her friend's head's been cut off, and like that kind of shit. Some of that shit's really happened because like literally like Ted Bundy like went to sorority houses and murdered a bunch of women, and like this sort of stuff, it feels kind of like an allegory for that. But one of the reasons I want to mention that story is it has some of the craziest Stephen Gammell art attached to it that blows my mind. And it just, so in the documentary, it talks about how Stephen Gammell is this really mysterious figure, even to Alvin Schwartz, who worked with him on these books, and how he doesn't give interviews. And no one like knows hardly anything about this guy. And he would just take the art or take the stories, and then he would be inspired to draw this art in some way. And the art he pairs with this one is a man in a rocking chair with like a line that is wrapped around a head that is like towing him through space. And then there's like a cosmic monster coming out of the fucking clouds. It's crazy. And like, it has nothing, like the story is just about a woman in a dorm room who's missing her head. But then this art is about the head and like what it's gone on to be, I guess.
I don't know. Yeah, I actually pulled it up. I'm looking at it right now. The story's called Oh Susanna.
Oh Susanna. Yeah, that's right. Man, and like so that is like the art in this book is every bit as powerful, if not more so, than the stories themselves. So that guy's a genius, and it's really fascinating to me that he's this mysterious figure that like not a lot of people know about him or like know much about him.
And the art style is absolutely amazing, and it's so like I love the way that it's like a lot of the image isn't fully completed. It like fades out into like darks and whites and stuff. Well,
it looks like ink blots almost, right?
Yeah,
it's all black and white, and it's all runny. It all looks like it's got these like tendrils and wisps coming off of everything and drips and everything. Yeah. It's incredible. I think it's about time we got to get to this movie so we can talk about it. Before we do, I wanted to mention, so you probably saw, and maybe you're curious, when you pulled up this episode, it's named something different than what we've done in the past. In the past, we've always had episode dash and then the episode number. We've decided we're gonna move away from that, and it's for a couple of reasons. We're gonna start having read episodes, watch episodes, and then of course there's gonna be one like this where it's read and watch. We think that's going to be a clear identifier to the listener of like what we've done. So we've read this book, we've watched this movie, and so now that's what we're talking about. And then it'll also be maybe a little more inviting to somebody who doesn't want to have to feel like they're coming in late to a party because it's episode 120 or whatever. Like, they can just click on it and be welcomed.
We'll still be keeping the episode titles, we'll still be keeping the episode numbers correlated with the episodes like we did here. We started the episode by saying it's episode 101. You know, we don't want to lose how many episodes we've done, and we want people to be able to identify which episode's which.
And I think that's cool, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be a cool way to, and you probably noticed as well, we played with the intro. So like, switching up the intro and kind of like just jumping into it rather than having it be like intro to music into the episode. I think it's really cool to just get the atmosphere from the music and then roll straight into all of it instead of having any interruptions. Yeah,
and that's the idea behind it. Feel free to let us know what you think of it. Maybe give it a few times before you leap to it, because it's going to be different at first, but give it a few chances, see how it goes. And then, we're open to tweaking things going forward, but I think that's what we're going to try for now. And we're going to keep track of the episode numbers internally. We're going to put it in the show notes. It's going to be in the intro itself. It just won't be in the title anymore. So that's all it is. It'll also make iTunes happy. Apparently they don't want you to have episode numbers in your titles. That's like a big deal. Don't really know why, but we're now trying to be more compliant with them. We'll see if that helps. But okay, man. So before we get to the actual movie, is there anything else about the documentary that you want to mention before we move past it?
We talked about the illustrator, we talked about the author, and some of the, the banning that went on. Yeah. I thought it was really cool to see, although I wasn't necessarily one of the people who was so affected by this material, I always find it really cool when people are that passionate about it. They're, like it's carried forward. They're doing it as, we saw the photographer who was stuck doing wedding photos and stuff like that. And she was like, I want to do something more creative. So she started trying to recreate some of the illustrations with actual people, which I thought was just super cool. Yeah. And I felt like the documentary really emphasized what made these stories important and what kind of the legacy is going forward with them.
Oh, that reminds me. As of 2017, the books had sold over 7 million copies worldwide, a number that is sure to balloon with this film coming out, I imagine, right?
I'm sure.
And it probably already has. I really liked the stuff about Alvin Schwartz's son. He was one of the main figures in the documentary, and his relationship with his father was clearly very troubled, right? And he had regrets about how he left things with his father, who ended up dying of cancer. And I really, it was really affecting to me to see him sort of defending his father's legacy to this woman who was the spearhead of the ban the book movement. To see him standing up for his father's legacy and defending it, even though he had such a contentious relationship with him, and even admittedly didn't get the books. Like he said, he never really got them and thought they were creepy and weird, and even at one point told him that he should be doing something that mattered more than this, which really upset him.
Yeah, and that made me both of these things make me think about his relationship with his father and how nobody's here forever. And just letting people know what they mean to you and not trying, if there is a fight, kind of squashing that kind of stuff. Just stuff to think about. I think that it's really powerful. And then the other thing is the way that he was so passionate about this stuff, and the aspect that I didn't know going in was the amount of research that he did with the folklore, which I find to be a very noble pursuit and passion. I think that like it was brought up in the documentary, the way that he's collected these stories and put them all into she mentioned children who are reading books for the first time will read these things and then see the sources and the places that he found these, and they can go check out other books and read more on the subject, and not only just making children read, but also having a permanent place for these folk stories to live on. I think is really a really powerful pursuit.
It's almost like a historian thing to do, right? Like it's literally connecting the past with the present in a cool way, and extending these stories out so that they don't get forgotten, even though they were probably passed along orally for many, many years.
Definitely. And I think that that's the thing that I take away is just that everybody's art is different. Everybody is going to be passionate about different things. So just hearing him say that he said that to his dad made me think if somebody has art that you don't necessarily connect with just in there, but it makes them happy and it's a pursuit that you can see that they're actually working hard towards, I think that it's just a matter of perspective, and kind of just let people, if it's not for you, maybe find something that is.
Yeah. I will, one more thing about those stories that occurs to me is that reading them was also inspiring to me even now, in that it showed me some of the basic building blocks of story in a way, because that's all that's really left in these. And it shows you this is a story, and this is why this one works for you. And it's easy to parse. And so in a way it was kind of inspiring to me, especially as it relates to short fiction. It makes me want to try and write stories that are kind of like some of these that are in these books. Mm-hmm. And it's cool in that way too, So and that's more like connecting to the lineage of folklore going throughout time, and how it's not a new thing to try and tell stories. It's actually one of the oldest things.
I agree with you. I like the simplified version of these stories. I felt the same way with game and stuff with Coraline. Writing children's fiction to me seems really enticing, and I know that it's deceivingly hard.
Yeah.
I know that there's way more to it than just write the simple story, but there's something about just writing a story and having the base structure there that you could extrapolate on and turn into a longer story. He could have taken some of these, and rather than it being just a page, extrapolated it out to be in my perspective, you could take one of these and extrapolate it out, add more details, add more twists, sure, and turn it into a full screenplay or something, and film it as a feature-length film.
Well, I think that's actually a cool segue into the movie, because that is essentially the task that was before our filmmakers here, and they had to decide how they were going to make this movie. And I remember when I first heard it announced, I thought it was going to be an anthology of just a bunch of different stories. But it's not. It's actually one unified story. And I don't want to get into spoilers just yet, but I was curious if you know anything about the process behind making this movie, how Guillermo del Toro was attached to it, because I know that we see his name a lot with this movie, and that sort of stuff.
So being a producer on a film is really interesting because it could mean so many different things. Being a producer could mean like you backed it financially. You were one of the people who, as the filmmaker was making decisions, the decisions had to go through. You know what I mean? Like basically being like the person that ideas are bounced off of. And sometimes you'll see like Guillermo del Toro presents scary stories to tell in the dark. Like, why didn't they just put the director's name there? Mm-hmm. In this case, Guillermo del Toro was fairly involved. Like he was highly involved in the decision-making process with André Øvredal. Okay. And just knowing Guillermo del Toro's like love for horror and his love for monsters specifically. Yeah. You know, you can, I have his Book of Monsters, I believe it's called. It's like an amazing book. It just shows like his collection of memorabilia and just like art that people have made throughout the years. And like the guy is like a curator of horror. He's so important to that community. And I think that him approaching these stories is so cool because, like you say, it's important to a lot of people. You know, it's formed a lot of people's, you know, artistic background. And going into this, I think the main thing that so I have a thing here that Guillermo del Toro and André Øvredal were talking about the things that they wanted to get done. And Guillermo del Toro met with CBS and he said, I wanted to take place in the 60s and I want the kids to die and not come back. Which is something that like I feel like in the books is important. You know, it's not necessarily like the kids like almost die or they're in peril or they're hurt, but they survive. It's like the kids die in these stories.
People die.
So people die. Yeah. So
in
keeping with
in
keeping with the source material, but still aiming it towards children, I think that was like that's a large gap to cross. You know, like making it like kill kids and kill people, yet still make it fair. Like as PG-13 would be the guideline here.
And that odd I don't know how to describe it. Like that task created sort of an odd film that was one of the things I liked most about it, was that the tension between how dark it was, yet it clearly being aimed at like a teenager to even young teenager audience. Mm-hmm. And how appropriate that felt for the source material. Like that was actually really appropriate for trying to adapt these books. So my hat's off to him for having that be a goal, because I think that is something that this film achieves.
When watching this film, I had to switch gears. I had to readjust my expectations fairly early on in the movie, and we can talk more about it. But I do want to mention also something very important to the filmmakers was the practical effects in this, and the creature design, and really nailing Stephen Gammell's illustrations. Like they wanted to represent everything that was on the page, which is again no small feat because it's a 2D image that it's sketched out. It's not within real 3D space. Like we said, like things fade out and fade in into white and black. So to bring it into a 3D space and make it look realistic. And I do think that they did a really good job. There's like, you know, you can tell that it's practical with some CG augmentation. Yeah. Some of it's better than others, but I feel like for the most part, I think that they did really well with the creatures.
Agree. Some of the standouts absolutely are that. And I think you can see Del Toro's touch, I think, quite strongly there in the creature design, in my opinion.
Definitely, yeah.
Because he knows what he's doing in that regard.
And there's even some with the story elements, something that kind of struck me that we can talk about in the spoiler section. But I do want to ask you, just overall, do you want to give your what was your reaction to it for non-spoiler people who are listening who haven't seen it yet? And then we can move into spoilers. How did you feel about the movie?
So I kind of want to get your take first, because I think my take might be unusual. So I want to hear what you thought of it first.
So I mentioned the readjusting expectations. Overall, after reading the story, and I think that this is a major factor in it. Having read the story, I appreciate a lot of the things that were going on in the film, but ultimately I was not the audience for this film. So I kind of didn't like it as much as I wanted to, but at the same time, I understood what it was, and I appreciated it for that fact, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So ultimately, I think I was let down a little bit, is what I'm trying to say. Let down a little.
Okay. Yeah. I had a weird reaction to this movie. So I went and saw it yesterday afternoon at 1:00, and I think there were 2 other people in the theater. So, so that was an interesting and a pretty large auditorium as well. I went into it like wondering, how are they going to do this? Because I think if you sit down to adapt this in one story, you're going to have a pretty strong decision to make early on. And that is this a movie for the 30-year-old fans of the original books? Or is this a movie for kids now, when young teenagers now, to get a similar experience of the books that the older fans had? Now, of course, you're going to have cross-pollination for both if you tried either one. But I think they tried to do the latter, right? Like, this is a movie designed for middle school kids, maybe like teenagers, like high school. And it sets out to do the same things that the book sets out to do. It has jokes, it has jump scares galore, and it has genuinely terrifying, creepy shit too. And it tries to do all three. The characters are archetypal and simple. There's not a lot of depth to them. They're fairly flat. There's some minor arcs going on, but mostly it's just like, it's the geeky girl. It's the goofy guy. It's the nerdy guy. It's the jock asshole. You know what I mean? Like, we recognize they're almost like horror archetypes, almost like a Cabin in the Woods type characters. And so when I started figuring out, like, somewhere early on in the movie, I'm like, this is what they're doing. They're setting up these archetypal characters. They're simple. It reminded me of noticing in the stories that sometimes the characters don't even have names. It's just a man. A man was doing this. A woman did this. He met a woman who did this. Maybe she has a first name. You know what I mean? Like, it's a lot of those kind of stories. And that was kind of how it felt here. It was like, we're going to keep it simple. It's going to be identifiable character archetypes. And the monsters really shine in that sense, right? And you got the haunted house trope, right? There's a lot of tropes in this movie, for sure. But a clever story evolves. And so I had a good time with this movie. And even though I'm not a huge fan of jump scares, like, I gave it a pass because that's what the books do. They tell you to grab your friend and yell, ah. So of course there's going to be jump scares in this movie, and they're going to be cheap sometimes. And they provide a certain thrill. And then there are genuinely horrifying moments as well. And I really want to talk about those in more specifics, but that is definitely spoilery, so I'm not going to go into any more details about it yet.
So you were talking about this just dawned on me, to your point, the archetypal characters, the tropes, and the fact that this is geared towards children. It's a movie for children. Yeah. This could be some of the first times that these kids are experiencing these tropes. Some of the first times they're experiencing these characters.
It's designed to be your first real horror movie. That's kind of what this movie is made to be.
Right, and it's a cool way to kind of introduce those things. And, I think that a horror fan will tell you, like, tropes can be fun, and tropes are fun in horror movies.
A genre fan. I think that's true for all genres.
Yeah. There's a reason why they're tropes, and there's a reason why they work. And, sometimes you subvert those tropes, sometimes you lean into them. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't necessarily, like something like Cabin in the Woods that you brought up was, although very archetypal, that's a subversion of that type of movie. You know what I mean? Ultimately, those characters, like the stuff that they go through, the way that things go down in that movie is a subversion of the genre.
Yes.
But I think having seen those things so many times, that's part of it. It just felt stale to somebody like me who's seen it a million times.
Yeah, that's fair.
But like I said, I can appreciate it for what it is. I like the idea. I love the idea, actually, of kids getting into horror. And I love the idea that, like, they didn't pull the punches of bringing the kids back, which I did. I was worried during the movie that, like, kids were going to come back.
Yep.
I was very worried about that. Ultimately, I think that what they were able to achieve is what the book set out to. Like you said, it's for kids, and it's an introduction. And it doesn't shy away from the scary stuff in the way that I think other like the example that comes to me a lot is the Jack Black film the Goosebumps, like, basically adaptation that came out.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Very similar situation. Taking a story and building it around multiple Goosebumps stories and kind of having them all in the same movie together. So very, very similar kind of situation. I think that if I wanted to see the version of this that I would have liked to have seen as like a 26-year-old man is I want to see the anthology, right? I want to see none of it connected. I want to see each individual story. Give me like slightly different stylistic things in each story. Different types of shooting, different types of maybe even have like multiple directors, that kind of thing. Like, and that's a dream, but like that you can't pitch that to a studio as well as you can pitch something like this. That's for kids.
What's interesting is I feel like you could still almost have that. But yeah, I mean that's like a Netflix story where it's like Love, Death and Robots, but for horror, and it's called Scary Stories, and each one is a 10 or 15 minute short that embodies one of these iconic tales. I could totally see that, and I get kind of missing that, or like feeling like you wish that is what we got. I can see that.
And I think that's like the version of this that, like you said, like the 30-year-old people who grew up with the story would have liked to have seen. Like show us the Netflix adaptation that like completely encapsulates everything that like it means to them then and now. Yeah. But overall, I think we should move into spoilers because we're getting to that line where we think we need to start talking
we've
about
talked about so much we're almost spoiling it.
But it sounds like I talked a lot about it. I want to say one more good thing generally is the effects are in terms of like creating monsters and like just the love of monsters. Guillermo del Toro kills it here. He understands what makes monsters creepy. He understands what makes them stick with people, and he also like a movie like Shape of Water shows you like it's not just about like fearing them, it's about like falling in love with these creatures as well too. So, and you can tell like there's that love there and that horror pedigree. So shout out to that aspect of this film.
And that reminds me, much like the books, if you're an adult and you're trying to judge, like they're going to be people who see this movie and go, I can't show this to my children.
Right.
You got people dying, you got children dying, you have real scary shit that scares me, an adult. I can't show this to a middle schooler. No way. It's going to give them nightmares. Like, and you're going to have some of the same reactions that people had to these books.
Right. Which ultimately, like, mission accomplished.
That's what you want, right, for an adaptation of this.
In terms of a recommendation, like, who do you recommend this film for? And, like, what do you think that people should take away from this general discussion here?
Yeah. I think you should introduce your children. Now, it's easy for me to say this. I'm not a parent. But introduce your children to horror with this movie. If they're curious about it, if it's fun, let them go see it with their friends. I think they'll have a blast. I think they'll all be talking about it later. I think they'll have nightmares. I think it'll upset them, some of them. But that can be good. That can be part of growing up. And I would absolutely show my children this if I had any. So in that sense, it's good for them. I think if you're an adult, you will enjoy it as well. I think maybe you'll be a little bored by some of the tropes if you're a dyed-in-the-wool horror fan. But if you can come at it the way I did, which is appreciating what they're trying to do here by having it be so accessible, this isn't the smart, award-winning horror that we're getting great movies these days coming out. Like, this isn't that. This isn't going to be Hereditary or The Babadook or something like that, where it's got all these layers and symbolism. Like, you're not going to get that here, really. But in a metatextual sense, I think it's a great adaptation, in my opinion, or at least a good one, and one I had fun with. And I think, especially if you're a fan of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, I think it's worth seeing.
I would say it's definitely worth seeing, especially if like you have a young one that is interested in it. And that's the main thing, I think, to take away from the book and the movie. It's like, if there is interest there, if your kid is interested in it, and this is, again, from my perspective as like a younger person that doesn't have kids either, I think, like, in terms of like my opinion on the books, it's like, if your kid is interested in it, let them read it. You know what I mean? Like let them try it out. And then if it's something that they engage with, great. And if it's something that they don't like, they'll put it down. They're not going to keep reading it. And like, it's not going to take them long to realize if it's for them or not. Yeah, you might have to deal with a couple nightmares, but the same thing with the movie. If there's interest there and your kid is interested in horror, I think that this is a good movie to introduce somebody to. In terms of like, if you're older and like you said, somebody who's really, really steeped in horror, I don't know how much enjoyment you'll get out of it, but if you like the books, check out the movie, I would say.
Yeah, and you could probably wait for it to come out of the theater, probably fine. I did have a good experience in the theater, even though I was like one of the only ones there. Just because something about seeing on the huge, like this big screen and being in like alone in a room was actually kind of scary in a way, which was cool, even midday. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Which did you have a full theater when you saw it?
I had like 10 people in the theater with me, maybe.
Okay. I'm really curious if anybody saw it on like opening night in a theater full of teens. Because I bet you there was some screaming. I bet you there was some of that like audience participation that might have been really fun. That might have honestly add to the experience.
So I do, that just made me think of something. Just in terms of like people who go, like teenagers who go to see horror movies. I think if you have a teenager like 15, 16, they might view this movie as too tame. They might be like,
really?
Except for like, I think some of it. I think that they're looking for like something like, at least when I was like 15, 16, like I was looking for horror movies that scared me in ways that I couldn't even comprehend. You know what I mean?
Well, and
like,
that's why I said almost more middle school. Like this is almost, even though the kids are high schoolers, I think this is like if you're like 12 or 13, this might be really, really up your alley if you're into horror at all.
As far as like kids sneaking into horror movies and stuff like that, like I don't see, like, first of all, this is PG-13, so they probably wouldn't sneak in, but I don't think that this is necessarily what like an older teen is looking for. Like you say, I think it's like honestly like children to, maybe it's a little scary for children, but like like middle schoolish.
Yeah, you're gonna have trouble figuring it out because, like I said, there are parts of this movie that almost seem like too much. So let's get into spoilers, man. So I want to say we're gonna go with full spoilers now. I think we've given all the recommendations we need to give, and so we can talk about specifics. Do you want to open with anything?
I mean, so Harold, like the transformation body horror scene of Harold, and like I think his name was like Tommy, like with the hay, fucking, like choking out of his mouth, and like coming out of his like his fingers. He's like flicking it off and stuff. That was legitimately like that was awesome. That was really cool. I like that. Yeah. And the way that Harold kept like showing up and like he's trying to walk through the corn maze or the corn field, I guess, and like Harold keeps popping up. It just looked really good, and that brings me to something else that I should have mentioned before. Each person has like kind of a legendary horror creature performer within the suits.
Really?
So like people that you've probably seen. I can't tell you exactly who is in the Harold suit, but like. The person who was in the toe, like the missing toe, is it's the same performer from like Mama. He was in he's been in like a lot of stuff. He is like this body I don't know if you would call it a disorder. He's got like a body it's like he's like very, very skinny.
Okay.
Like he's very skinny and lanky. Anyway, he is known for those performances, and then the jangly man, I think is what they call him in this film. Yeah. All the twists and turns of the neck and the back and the contorting. That's a performer who's actually like, I think they found him. I watched a video and they said that like he had been a performer on America's Got Talent or something like that, like a contortionist.
That's crazy. I actually might know who that is. Then I've seen clips of it.
So I think that they brought him in to really all the twisting of the back and like walking and all that stuff, the way he was walking on all fours, like the actual performer did that, which I mean that's amazing. Like those performers deserve all the credit for these bringing these creatures to life.
The Red Room sequence to me is the thing that I feel like I'm always going to remember about this movie. I actually thought it was brilliant. Yeah. The terror of that kid running from the slow moving, creepily smiling, beady-eyed creature that is just slowly shuffling down the hall at him, and every which way he turns, there she is, yet she's a little bit closer. And so much so that like it becomes truly like mind like boggling when she's right there, he's turning around, and then he gets literally absorbed by her. Mm-hmm. And he's just gone. And he was one I was like convinced was not going to like really die, right? And he really dies and is gone. And that sequence is terrifying to me. I don't know, like that was really something.
I did really like that sequence. The other thing that I like is the dread that they built up. Like how many times they kept talking about the Red Room and the clever use of being like the Red Room, don't go near that Red Room, like the research, whatever it was in the research education development building or whatever. He's like, I can't go to the Red Room. It might not actually be a red room. Like I can't go anywhere near any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So it wasn't. And then the idea of the emergency lights clicking over and having it be like that very, very red lighting. I think all that really worked, and I think it looked great on camera. I was definitely expecting him to at least try to like swim move the creature, because there's like a lot of hallway on either side. So I was like, is he gonna try to like dodge around it or what?
I think he was just fucking in shock though, because you would be like, what's happening is impossible.
Right.
So I could see just being so afraid you can't do anything in that moment, you know? And like, even because he feels like he can't escape, and like it does feel inescapable, because if you swim around her, there she is again. Like, you know what I mean? Because like reality's broken in this moment.
Yeah, and I thought that was what was going to happen. He was going to like edge around her and then like keep running down the hallway, and then she'd appear in front of him again.
Yeah.
I just thought that was that he didn't, him not doing it. I was like, I would have at least tried that. But I liked it.
Maybe.
I thought it was cool. Let's talk about the other creatures. So we talked about, I think we've actually talked about all of them. The toe, the missing toe.
Well, there's the red spot moment that was gross. All the spiders, and then the big toe sequence, which is funny. I didn't mention it early, but like the big toe always reminds me now of Rawhead Rex, another project we covered a long time ago, because of the idea of a farmer finding something in his field, was like how Rawhead Rex the story begins, and so I always think of Rawhead. You know what I mean? And so that's always just a fun like podcast thing, I guess, for our podcast that I think of.
Funny.
But yeah, the idea that was like I knew a monstrous jump scare was coming, and they did. But like genuinely, like I had trouble watching him come out from under that bed and like creep up and like peek over the lip, knowing that a jump scare was coming. And like that is almost in like nowadays that's considered like cheap. And rightfully so, because it is. Yet it still does have like a thrill to it, you know? And horror can be that way. And so I like, and like we said, that's something from the books. And so in that sense, I forgave it in a way that I probably wouldn't forgive a lot of other movies. Like in a lot of other movies, I'd be like, oh, that was so fucking cheap. But I kind of forgave it.
I don't really like this narrative of people who are like very quick to just say like, I like horror movies, but I don't like jump scare horror movies.
Yeah.
Because I think there's something not only snobby about that, I think there's something like kind of incorrect about that. Because you mentioned, I don't want to spoil anything from this movie, but you mentioned Hereditary, which actually is a movie that has jump scares in it.
Okay.
But clever jump scares at that, but there are jump scares. Yeah. So it's not about, I think the problem becomes movies that are only jump scares. There's no atmosphere. It's just jump scares. Every time the characters go around a corner, there's going to be a jump scare, or like something like that, like the overuse of jump scares. But I don't like the idea of people saying like, I don't like horror that is this, I don't like horror that is that, because like there's always outliers.
Well, in the defense of that argument though, is that sometimes there's an over-reliance on it, you'll see. And it's always comboed with a loud sound after a moment of silence. And a piercing loud sound, because like they know that because of our biology, we're going to have a reaction if you hit us with a surprising sound and fast moving image. And so it's kind of cheap to like repeatedly lean on that and go like, this is how I'm going to scare the audience, because you're not doing the work of building something creepy. Now, that's not to say you can't do it in a movie, like you're saying. Like you can have that in a movie that does a lot of other things right. But there are definitely there's been a lot of movies that come out that like that's the one note they got, and they just play it again and again throughout.
Yeah, it's definitely used as a crutch in horror. There's no doubt about that. I guess my argument would be like, if there's an incredible movie, like a movie that just like narratively tells a terrifying story, has amazing atmosphere, does everything else right, and has jump scares, I guarantee that you're not going to say I don't like that movie because of the jump scares. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I guess that's where I land on it.
It's a tool in the toolbox, and the problem is it's been used way too much sometimes. But it's like it's not. Yeah, I agree. It's not like saying you can't use that tool, because I think it is a legitimate one. And that brings me back to like, this movie isn't only jump scares. It has other scares. Like that hallway scene is not a jump scare scene. It is a building inescapable horror scene, right? And there's no loud sound. Like he gets like slowly hugged to death, essentially, and absorbed. So that is a scene that doesn't end in a jump scare. And so and the jangly man stuff, a lot of that was a different kind of scare too. It was more, it almost reminded me more of that like hide and seek, like you're running and hiding from the monster and it's looking for you. It's like a more classic monster movie thing, right? I like the Mitai Dodie Walker stuff though. We should mention that, because you said, what did you think of hearing that in the film?
I thought we were getting the full Mitai Doti Walker. Like I thought we were just gonna get the head down the chimney and the dog back and forth, and that was how we were gonna get it. But then they continued it on. I think I would have preferred it, more close to the actual like normal thing. But I didn't realize what they were trying to do with the Jangly Man until after I left the theater.
Okay.
What's that? Did you understand that like this character, Ramon, right? His name is Ramon, I think. The like draft dodger.
Yeah, the draft dodger character, which I feel bad calling him that, but that's one of his identifiable traits. Yeah, he was the main guy, the main like protagonist dude.
Right. So he mentions like in the cell, like that's when he tells her like I dodged the draft. It's because my brother, like they send him back in pieces. And I didn't realize like that's why he was scared of that's why he was coming for him, because he was in pieces.
Yeah.
And it's like that sort of fear of like what happened to his brother and like something coming after him, and like which also I wanted to ask you, like what are your thoughts on this, like setting in the 60s Vietnam stuff, even though it was a book that was from the 80s?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it felt like they were definitely leaning on the like Richard Nixon thing.
Yeah.
There was like a political thing kind of being said there.
Is that like parallels to kind of like a certain president we have right now?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that also shows like you can live in a time where things are not just, and the good person, the right thing doesn't happen, and good people don't always win, and like things like that, right? Like you can definitely see a lot of that. I want to revisit that, because what you're talking about with the Jangly Man, because I think there's a little bit of that for all of them now that you mention it. Definitely with the Red Spot, right? Because that is sort of the sister who's been so vain throughout, and she's sort of obsessed with her physical appearance. And then she's the one who gets this grotesque growth on her face that bursts into spiders. And that is that sort of morality, like don't be so obsessed with your looks kind of lesson, I guess. And then you get Harold, who is definitely a parable about bullying. Because we see Tommy repeatedly, like first time we meet Harold, he's beating him up and throwing shit at him, calling him names. And we see that throughout, and then the bully kind of gets what's coming to him and gets turned into a scarecrow himself. I don't know, and like he's an empty man full of straw. I'm wondering if that means something. So bringing that back, what's your take on the Red Room sequence then, and how that creature relates to sort of our goofy guy? Because that's the one that I'm having trouble drawing the direct comparisons, although I feel like they must be there to be made.
Yeah, it's a good
I know
question.
it's a naked woman, so maybe it's that, because remember he has the pen that's like a naked woman deal.
Yeah, I think you're right there.
Yeah, and that's a naked woman. So maybe that's part of it, right?
Right, and like the I don't know. I feel like there's probably something being said about like the depiction of each of the women, like the way that like it's like a scantily clad woman versus like a dead, like seemingly dead. I'm not sure, but like, and
creature.
also like bloating body.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. I think you're right. That there's something about that pen there.
Maybe the way he's been treating women in his life or something, and like a lesson to be learned there. Yeah, there's something about that. And then of course the main progenitor of that is the scary stories. Something Bellows. Is it Sarah Bellows? I think it might have been.
I think it's Sarah Bellows.
Yeah, and so she was locked in this prison, and it's interesting because I don't think that's an actual story from the Scary Stories, and she would tell these stories to people, and then she got accused of poisoning, but it was actually her family who was like poisoning everyone with mercury and had been abusing her and locking her up, and there was definitely parallels with her and our main protagonist, right? And who also told scary stories and also felt like an outcast, and like she'd been abandoned by her family. So in that sense, like I like how each of the things sort of links up, and it does it in a way that isn't too heady, and it isn't like an inaccessible thing, right? Like it's something that like is sort of surface level, but it's there still.
And like clearly the story that ultimately happens to her is kind of like her fear of writing, and like wanting to write stories, but being afraid of it, and then having to ultimately write a story in order to save the day and like fully tell a story.
Yeah, the power the stories hold for her, and the power that they held for Sarah Bellows. And then the idea of coming to grips with your family leaving you and having you not blame yourself. And like Sarah Bellows is this monster who is killing people because she embodies it, but then she has to tell her, you're not a monster. The monster is your family, and what they made you. And in a sense, she's telling herself that like she's not the reason her mother left, right? That her mother left on her own, and that she should be mad at her mother and not mad at herself. Yeah, maybe, you know. I think there's a nice kind of lesson there. We also get a Breaking Bad alum. Hank is in this movie. I don't know the actor's actual name. I do, but I'm drawing a blank on it. And that does remind me that we get a final scene where they're driving, and it's him, it's his daughter, and it's the sister who had the red spot, who we were told was like institutionalized, and she's got this horrific scar on her face. So she's been changed, right? And it's not just gone. She has this huge scar, and they're setting out to, what was it, like to learn more about the Bellows? What was it? Was it track down the stories? What was it exactly?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Sequel bait is what I call it.
Sequel bait, exactly. And I thought it was interesting because most of the stories that we got, not all of them, but most of them seemed to come from book 3. Did you notice that? A lot of our biggest stories came from the 3rd volume. Harold's from the 3rd volume. The Red Room creature is from the 3rd volume. I think the Red Spot might even be from the 3rd volume.
I think you're right, yeah.
Only the Big Toe, which is the opening story of book 1, is definitely not. And maybe a little bit others. But like most of it came from volume 3. So I feel like there's lots of stories still left to be reimagined. I could see them making a sequel to this movie. You could easily make a Scary Stories 2, Scary Stories 3. I mean, hell, the books did it. I don't know. Interesting, right?
Yeah. Guillermo del Toro talked about how he fought for the children dying, and I think that sequel baiting is the way that he was able to let that happen. Because it's very clear that they're like, we're on our way, and we're not going to forget our friends. We're going to go back and we're going to save them.
Oh, you thought they were going to save the friends? I thought they were just going to prevent more from happening.
I think they were like, yeah, we won't forget them, and I think that's kind of what they were saying, is like, we're going to save them. And I assume that in a sequel they would have to save their friends or something, but I don't know.
Yeah, that would be kind of a bummer. Yeah, you're right. Maybe they will go down that route, because I like the idea of the friends are permanently dead.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's the story to tell.
And maybe they'll leave them dead. Who knows? Maybe that'll be what they find out. Or maybe if you try and save them, what if what you bring back is actually a horrific abomination of version of the friend, right? And so there's a lot of stories like that, like bringing people back from the dead is not always good, and there's a lot of folklore around that sort of thing. So you could play with it in that sense and have some of the same actors return, but maybe like the characters don't actually come back just like fine now.
Right. So what's your excitement level for a sequel?
I'm intrigued, and once again, like, I don't know if this isn't like high art. It's not something that like I feel like it's a must see in the theater. But I would watch it. I would absolutely watch a sequel to this movie, especially if it was like same quality level, right? Like a same attention to monster detail, and there was new monsters inspired by the Stephen Gammell art. Like, I'm enough of a fan of this material, that I would be into it, especially if they don't just go the expected route and they do something interesting and unique with it. I could definitely be into it, man. It seems like you're maybe not there, and that's fair.
I don't know. I'm of 2 minds. So the one part of me, let me just separate myself, right? So pretend I didn't read these stories before going to see this movie. I'm not going to watch the sequel, personally.
Fair enough, yeah.
But like you said, I think that like there's enough attachment to the stories and wanting to see like what an adaptation of this.
What about 13-year-old James Bailey?
I think 13-year-old James Bailey would be into it.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So that says something too.
Right. And like, there you go. Like, and I think that's cool. There's definitely a reason to have specific art for specific people. And so this being geared towards kids, I'm all for it. But personally, if I would watch a sequel. Having read the material and like being excited for like what other adaptations of the creatures could look like and that kind of stuff. Like I said, I would have liked to have seen a more anthology version of this, but like I would see a sequel. But I will say that like if you have no attachment to any of the creatures or any of the stories, I think that your mileage may vary for this stuff.
I think that's fair. And I think that's true. I also think this was an ambitious idea for how to adapt material like this. And it was very like metatextual in a way. It was very like on the nose. It was very, we are adapting these stories, and it's very obvious. There's so many nods to the books, and it's not even nods, it's direct, right? Like we have a book in the movie that is writing the stories.
Which I didn't mention. I at the very beginning, I think I talked about how like I could see some of the story elements that Guillermo del Toro may have influenced. Do you remember in Pan's Labyrinth when like she finds the book and it's like revealing itself to her, like the maps and stuff?
Oh yeah, I'd forgotten that
kind
part,
of
yeah,
it kind of like really, that when the text was being written on the page, it really, I mean, not only did it make me think of like Tom Riddle and Harry Potter with the diary, but also it made me think of like Pan's Labyrinth with the like the maps like developing on the page for the character.
Yeah. So I want to end, I think, talking a little bit about, because we do a podcast on adaptations, and I want to think more about this style of an adaptation, which I think is kind of a unique one, and like, what do we think of it? So I think that might be a good place to leave it. So I'm definitely curious to know what you think. Like, was it too on the nose? Was it too obvious? Like, we are doing an adaptation, nudge, nudge, or was it something else? What was it for you? Would you want to see more projects done in this way? Or does it feel like this is uniquely suited to this material, or what have you?
I can't say that I don't like adaptations that are like this, because like comic books that I loved growing up are being adapted with a wink and a nod and like a nudge nudge as they're being put on screen. That's so like there's a lot of that going on in the superhero movies and things like that. It's not that I don't like adaptations like this. I just think that it's going to take a specific type of material. You know, like it's not like a movie like Annihilation isn't gonna be a great adaptation if it's like, remember the book, nudge nudge, and this is you know what I mean, like it's just different types of stuff. So if like, I think that this is very fitting of the material. I think that they did go I think it was a little more kiddie than even the books, just because they were trying to tie it together, maybe make it a little more broad for a movie for kids.
Yeah.
But
I don't know, man. Those books are, remember some of those stories? They're pretty kiddie.
Well, but some of them are like yeah. I don't know. There's definitely some kiddie stuff in there, but I think like the imagery is much more than we see in the movies.
Absolutely. I mean, they did their best on some of that Stephen Gammell stuff, you know, to emphasize it. But you're right. It wasn't like omnipresent. It wasn't like the whole movie was animated in a way that was all evocative of the Stephen Gammell. Because in the Stephen Gammell stuff, like the humans are scary. You know, they're like outlines of people distorted. With like like their bodies are weirdly shaped, and like everything about it's upsetting. If you were to try and watch a cartoon animated in that way, it would be a tough watch, and it would definitely be disturbing as hell.
I would mess that up. I would love that, like fully animated, like this style. Like I would watch the hell out of that.
Yeah, man, and I agree. So like the idea of like an anthology series animated in that style or something that goes through each of these stories, like I'm into that too. So. I think the world's big enough for both. I guess I just enjoy the idea of like having some fun with this thing and trying something, and like maybe it doesn't fully work in every way, but they tried something different. You know, they tried something that like I don't think I would have ever predicted that they would adapt this material this way.
Yeah, I think what I'll walk away with is I'm happy that this exists for, like we say, like in terms of introducing a new audience to horror. And like delivering the tropes and having it done in an artistic way, and like getting actually like well developed, interesting creatures that aren't just like, they are people in suits, but they don't look like, you know, like what we think of as like a man in a suit as the bad guy, like of the horror movie. It like there was a lot of like painstaking artistic effort that went into these, and I think it's cool that exists for people of a certain age. So I'm all for it ultimately. Like I think that it's great, but like I said, mileage may vary depending on where you're at.
And that's fair, man. All right, so I think that's probably good for Scary Stories. I think we'll reveal our next week's project at the very end of the episode. So before we get to that, we just wanted to thank one of our newest patrons, Todd M. We got a few new patrons for the special offer, and we're thankful to all of them. Definitely look forward to some more commissioned projects coming up.
Yeah, thank you to Todd and everyone who is a patron, because you now have a token to put towards whatever project you like to. And if you're not a patron but you would like to become one, go to patreon.com/inktofilm for more information on that.
Absolutely. And if you wanted to support the podcast in another way that doesn't cost you anything, and that's leaving a rating and review online, whatever form you can, especially iTunes is good. And barring that, telling a friend in real life is always a great way to share the love and get the word out.
Connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at inktofilm. And join the Council of Inklings. It's where we post polls and interesting adaptation information that we find. It's a great way to connect with the community.
Yeah, and people talk about our episodes, talk about different adaptations, all sorts of things on there. Definitely join up. And yeah, we wanted to thank Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music. And thank you to Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts.
And we wanted to tell you about our next project. It's going to be a commission project. Enough tokens were put towards it. It's going to be Enemy Mine.
Yeah, so this is a movie I've never seen, a story I've never read. It's, I believe, a novella. Came out in the 80s, I want to say, and the film definitely came out in the 80s. So we're doing kind of a throwback project here, but it was commissioned by Stephen E., who has been someone who's commissioned a lot of stuff going on leading up to now. He got his extra bonus token with everybody else and was able to put 2 right towards this project and unlock it right away. So we're getting to it first come, first serve kind of deal.
Yeah, and if you have those tokens and you haven't picked your project yet, be sure to reach out and let us know.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, this has been a great project for me. I really enjoy talking about scary stories. Like I said, very important for me. So it's been a lot of fun. So thank you for listening, and we hope you come back next week for Enemy Mine. Until next time.
Thanks for listening.